So we're in this series, Campfire Stories. And some of my favorite stories, some of the best stories are actually hero stories. So a lot of the stories that we're working through in this series aren't hero stories. There are heroes at work in them, but they're not all hero stories. But man, there are some great hero stories that we find in Scripture. And the ones that get me the most fired up, the hero stories that get me the most excited are stories of heroes who are heroes not because they were perfect, not because they always got it right, not because they managed to live life unscathed, or that they were uniquely qualified, like some sort of superhero, they have some sort of special power. But they're heroes because in the moments that really mattered, they had the courage to get it right. So I know that for most of us, we probably don't live our lives on a daily basis thinking about Samuel, thinking about this man who lived thousands of years ago, and we don't think, I wonder what Samuel would do right now. I wonder, as I think about what's about to happen, I wonder how Samuel's story could impact the way that I approach what's in front of me, the problems that are in front of me. We don't think a lot about Samuel, probably. Maybe some of us were actually hearing that Samuel exists in Scripture for the first time this morning. But we might have heard a piece of his story. Might have been the piece, this very simple version of a part of Samuel's story. If you actually trace his story, he's involved in all kinds of extraordinary moments that God works through him, or that he's part of God doing within the life of the people of God. But God called Samuel by name. And then Samuel eventually responded, "Speak, for your servant hears." Right, this is kind of probably the most memorable part of this early stages of Samuel's life. And so there's this moment. So as a kid, I heard the story of Samuel in a Sunday school class. When I was little, I was so fascinated by all the dynamics at play. And so I had taken that in, and then at some point, down the road, I'm at our church. And I'm in the basement of our church, and I'm working my way through. It's dark. I was probably, my parents, we always stuck around and turned the lights off after services were over. And so by myself, turning the lights off in the basement, it's amazing how with every light that turns off, the church basement gets a little creepier, right? It's just kind of how it works. And so I'm bravely working my way through room by room by room, turning off all the classroom lights, all those kinds of things. And so I get to the point where I'm in the basement, and I'm working, and I hear, "Nathan." I would prefer to not have that happen, right? This is okay, so Nathan. And so here's little Nathan trying to figure out what to do in this darkening basement. And I'm like, I know what to do. I'll do what Samuel did. And so into that darkness of the church basement, I said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And I was like, here we go, baby. This is going to be amazing. Never know what's going to happen. So I speak, and I just wait. And nothing. Nothing. And I did exactly the right thing. I did the Samuel moment exactly like I was supposed to do. I know from Sunday school, this is how it works. What's God going to tell me? There's going to be something extraordinary that I'm now going to know, this unique relationship, this unique conversation. Nothing, just silence. So that was my Samuel moment. It's kind of a letdown. I thought you guys were waiting for something more than that. It's actually the whole story. That's it. And so what I did learn a few things from this. One is I learned that there's actually more to the Samuel story than just a moment, right? This moment of courage that says, "Speak, for your servant hears." There's more to the story than just the moment. Also, along the way, I've learned as I've lived my life in a relationship with God, I actually don't just want a Samuel moment where God says something to me and I just sort of carry that with me for the rest of my life. I want Samuel moments along the way to lead to a Samuel-style approach to living, this Samuel-style story of living life in step with God, step by step by step, as he speaks and we respond. So not just some one beautiful moment along the way, but a life lived like that. I've also learned, and many of you have learned this along the way, the hard thing about Samuel moments is that they actually don't usually take place in quiet, simple kinds of places. Not like sitting around a campfire and we hear God clearly because it's just us, a campfire, and the mountains laid out before us. We have these moments along the way where God is trying to get our attention, where God is speaking, but it's happening while everything else is happening, with all the noise, the things that are happening in our lives. In the midst of our normal lives, our real lives, God speaks, and it's do we hear him? We have to sort this out, not in the quiet places, but in the messy, noisy places, where God speaking might actually even seem like it's an interruption, where God speaking might be an interruption, or it's not, because we're not hearing him at all, and we're just continuing to go about whatever it was we had planned on doing. So here we are as a people. We go about our lives. We want God to speak. We want God to be near us. We look at a world that seems so broken, and we want the world to be less broken, but we just don't know where to start. Maybe it'd be good to start with a story. So Samuel, there's more to the story. Samuel, his mother longed to have a child. His mother was dealing with infertility. His mother begged God to give her a child. His mother went to the temple and prayed fervently. Actually, if you look at the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, you'll see the story of Samuel's mother praying, so much so that the priest looked at Samuel's mother who's praying, and he made the assumption that she'd had too much to drink because she was so emphatic in her prayers. He actually ends up rebuking her for it. She says, I'm not drunk. I'm just pouring out my heart to God. God, would you give me the desire of my heart? And as she's praying, as she's asking God for this work, this child, she makes a promise to God. She's not negotiating with God. She makes a promise to God. She says, if you give me a child, God, I promise that I will live my life open-handed with this child. I'll give this child to you to do whatever work you want to do through this child. I won't keep this child for myself. But God, would you do this thing? So God eventually grants this request. And Samuel's mother follows through on what she promised that she would do. And actually there's this beautiful moment where she presents Samuel in the temple as like this child that God's going to use in powerful kinds of ways. And she looks at the priest who was critical of her earlier and says, you remember when I was praying? This is what I was praying for. Beautiful. The priest himself has some issues with his family. His sons have not been faithful. This is the family business as being priests, right? His sons have made choices about how they're going to approach this priestly work. Actually, his sons are the kind of guys who take the work of the Lord and they make it about what they receive for it. They make sure they get the very best. They make sure they get the choice pieces of it. They make sure that their lives are padded in all sorts of ways because of the work that they do as they work between God and his people. And God says, this is disgusting to me. This is not okay. And so God speaks to Eli. Eli has actually already picked up on this, has rebuked his sons for their behavior. God speaks to Eli and says, I will not put up with this. There are ways that your sons, your family is approaching this that are so disgusting to me that it's like, I'm not just going to fire them from the temple. I'm going to wipe your family off the earth. Some hard words. So this is the context. Now this young boy, Samuel, in the temple, Eli, the priest, who's now having to deal with the grief of God rebuking him so profoundly, the grief of watching his sons be unfaithful to the task that God has been working through their family. And it says this in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and there was no frequent vision, which is a big problem. Right? There's a big problem for the people of God. They need to hear. We need to hear what God has to say to give direction. But what we're going to see as this story plays out is they're actually making the same mistake we do. We confuse not hearing from God with God actually not speaking. Just because we're not hearing from God doesn't mean that God isn't speaking. It might just be that we're not paying attention to what he's saying. And then there's this profound moment of clarity that we'll see play out after seasons of God seeming like he's silent. We realize that God has been speaking all along. We've just allowed the noise and the mess of our lives to block our hearing. So it says, at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. It says the lamp of God had not yet gone out. This is nighttime. They would light a lamp that would give light to the space between the times that the sun was in the sky. And so it says it's not yet dawn. The lamp is still burning. So it's the middle or early morning hours. It's not yet dawn. It says the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Can cannot even fathom the proximity to this extraordinary thing, this extraordinary reminder of God's presence. They're all operating. The story is all playing out within earshot of the Ark of the Covenant. It says, then the Lord called to Samuel, and he said, here I am. But he ran to Eli. And Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, lie down again. So he went and lay down. So God speaks, and Samuel assumes that it's Eli calling him. And so he runs in and says to Eli, like, you called me, what is it that you need? Eli says, it wasn't me, go lay down. Like any of us who have ever had children in the night show up and say, hey, Mom, Dad, hey, I just thought about something. I need a drink of water. I need a snack. There's something under my bed that's scaring me. By the way, I've had these thoughts about the way the world works. How does Wi-Fi work? I just don't understand. Like all these kinds of questions that show up in the middle of the night. My kids have asked that exact question in the middle of the night. And it's like, I don't know. Right? Like, we don't. I don't even want to talk about this in the morning, actually. Let's just not do this. But so Eli's having this conversation with this boy. And says, and so then the Lord calls again, Samuel. And Samuel arose again and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, son, I did not call you. Go lie down again. There's extraordinary amounts of patience that's happening in Eli's life in this conversation. And it says, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So he's not yet a mature follower of God. He's in proximity, but he's learning his way through all of this. But the question is of maturity. What's more mature? A person who doesn't know God, but hears God speak and starts to be in conversation with God, or a person who we might say is mature. They know all kinds of things about God, but they've maybe along the way stopped or never started actually hearing God speak. It's why here at Countryside, when we gather to have table time, or we get together to have conversations where we unpack what it is that God's teaching us through the message, these message-based conversations, it's why we talk about, so what is it that God was saying? While you were listening to the message, while you were listening to or reflecting on the scripture that the message was based on, what was God saying to you? What are you going to do about it? And how can we help? Recognizing that maturity isn't just hearing, but actually putting into practice and then realizing that we actually have the opportunity to help others put it into practice as well. It's why these questions matter. It says this in verse 8, and the Lord called to Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls to you, you shall say, like I did years ago, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And so Samuel went and lay down in his place, now ready for this next conversation. Should God speak again? Should this interruption happen again? He knows what to say, so he's armed with it. It says, then the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. Now it's a conversation. Right now the connection has been made. Now the stage has been set for God to speak uniquely to Samuel, to give him a word. So this is what God says. It says, then the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which the two ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. And I get to that moment and I'm like, actually, wouldn't that be something? What we're about to hear, like, are your ears tingling? Like we're being warned that it's about to, like, there's like this buzz that's about to start happening. There's something that's so visceral that when we hear that God is doing this thing, that when we hear what God has to say, it's like there will be a physical response because it's such a significant thing. And God says, the ears of those who hear it will tingle. This will get the attention, not just that you'll know about it, but it's going to shake people up. There will be a physical response to what I'm about to say. So if your ears aren't yet tingling, God says they're about to be. How exciting is this? So on that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. Right? Eli has already heard from God. He knows what God has said in terms of judgment over his house. And so now God is telling Samuel, you need to understand what's about to happen. So this is what's about to happen against Eli and his house. He says, and I declare to him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. God says, therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. A process of doing the wrong thing, but then doing the right thing to respond. And God says, I will not put up with this forever. They're manipulating. They're doing what they should not be doing. They kind of know how the system works, and they're taking advantage of the system. I will not put up with this forever. Which means that proximity is not the whole answer, right? Just showing up and being in the building is not the whole answer. Here's Eli sleeping, as the story is told, like one room away from the ark, and yet there's stuff happening in his life and in the life of his family that proximity itself is not enough. Showing up, it's important to show up, but showing up is not enough. Not just close, in step with God. Showing up, getting close, but also listening and staying in step. So let's talk about what staying in step looks like. It's the difference. Many of us, as we have these, God is giving some direction in our lives. We receive that. And then we start to run a process of, do I want to do what God is asking me to do? Right? What's the cost? What might this require of me? What might this cost me relationally? What might this cost me as I step this in? So God is asking me to do this thing. Do I want to do what God is asking me to do? That question, actually, we can make that sound really spiritual. I'm really trying to wrestle with and discern this. I really want to make sure, like, all of this, like, do I want to do, fundamentally, actually, do you want to do what God wants you to do? There's actually a deeper question that maybe if we replace the do I want to do what God's asking me to do, we replace it with the real question. Do I want to live my life in step with God or not? Right? It's not do I want to do what God's asking me to do. Fundamentally, do I want to live my life in step with God or not? Because God is calling and inviting and saying, would you do what I'm asking you to do? And if we're saying, well, let me decide if that seems like it makes sense for me. Let me figure out and tabulate the costs and figure this out. God says, actually, let's get to the heart of the question. If we would just replace the one question that we can like wrap up in all sorts of ways to make ourselves feel better, but to say, if God is asking me to do a thing, the question is, do I want to live my life in step with him or not? And so then we wrestle our way through this, and so sometimes staying in step might sound a little like this, like I might not want to do this, but I do want to live my life in step with God, so I will. And we do the hard thing. So now Samuel, having heard from God, lay until morning. It doesn't say that Samuel slept deeply for the rest of the night. Now, Samuel lay until morning. Some of us have had these moments where we've had thoughts in the middle of the night. Now it's like, well, now we just wait for the sun to come up and we'll do something about it. We'll just sort of like wait. We'll lay there. We're not sleeping. We're just waiting for dawn. Samuel lay until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And Samuel said, here I am. Not exactly a run to Eli kind of moment, is it? It's a different sort of response this time. Some of us have been in text conversations with people, and all of a sudden the temperature changes in the conversation. We know it feels a little colder. The tone of the conversation has shifted, and so Eli said, what was it that he told you? Or what is it that God said? Don't hide it from me. May God do so to you and more if you also hide anything from me that he told you. So Eli knows, and so he's saying, if you don't participate in this, if you don't follow through on what God is asking you to do, Samuel, the cost is high. May God do to you the same thing that he's going to do to my family because of our disobedience. His threat was straight out of his own story, and he's teaching Samuel an important lesson. Do what God is telling you to do. He's watched his sons not do what God is telling them to do. And so he says, Samuel, don't get caught up in that. If God has asked you to do a thing, do the thing. And so Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Right? That's a hero moment, by the way. And Eli said, it's the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. And there's a weight to that. And for Eli to speak that, it didn't have to come to this, but it did. And now Samuel is faithful to the hard conversation. Samuel didn't ask to be invited into all of this, but But the disobedience of others led to a requirement of courage for Samuel, and he followed through. And then verse 19 of 1 Samuel chapter 3. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. I came across this verse as a part of my discerning process, as I was sensing that God was calling me to give my life to doing what it is that I have the privilege of doing. And I could remember as I was sorting through that, thinking, as I'm listening to God about the future, I'm going to make sure I'm listening to God in his word. And so I set out to read the Bible cover to cover with this thought of, I'm just going to make sure I'm hearing God clearly. I want to know exactly what his voice sounds like. So I'm just going to soak in his word as often as I can. And I came to this moment. I remember reading this and making that then a prayer for my own life, saying, God, would you do that for me? Would you make it so none of my words fall to the ground? That what you ask me to speak, I speak. We don't waste words. And there's a weight and a privilege and a promise in all of that. The weight that sometimes the truth is heavy. Sometimes it's a privilege. We get to speak forgiveness and hope and salvation, but in all of it is this beautiful promise. God's words spoken through us are never wasted. God's words are never wasted. And so it is a fearful and wonderful and beautiful thing for a preacher to have the opportunity to say, God, would you speak? And actually, like, my words, I'm perfectly fine with my words falling to the ground. I don't know, but God, the words that you have given me to speak, God, would they never fall to the ground? Would they be heard? And it says, and all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And then the first verse of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 4, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Remember where this started, the word of God was rare. And now the word of God has come to all of Israel through this story. This is a hero story. This is a beautiful moment of obedience and staying in step with God. Just a kid listening and then choosing to live in step with God. And then that kid, through the choices that he's made, God using him to change the way that his people lived, that God's people lived and experienced God. So 4 lessons. 1, Samuel heard but didn't understand, so he learned. He sought help in trying to make sense of this, that you don't have to be an expert to be faithful at what God is asking you to do. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to have memorized the Bible from cover to cover to hear God speak and then to respond and say, I want to be in step with you. Now, we learn along the way, and there's maturity that happens along the way, and that's all part of the process, but it's not like God inviting us into living our lives in step with him requires this massive understanding. God speaks, and Samuel can't yet make sense of it, but he learns. Actually, sometimes expertise gets in the way. Sometimes we actually know enough that we can do all sorts of mental gymnastics that can give us the wiggle room in terms of how we respond to what God is asking us to do. I've heard it said this way, that sometimes our biggest issue as Christians is that we're educated beyond our obedience. It's like we know too much, and so we use what we know. We're smart enough to do the mental gymnastics that we need that give us some wiggle room in our lives. Sometimes also our expertise can get in the way for others. That we hear, like Eli, man, it sounds like God is speaking. Let me tell you what I think God might be telling you. Right? It's so easy. But to say, I'm going to use what I know of God to point you to God and say, if God is trying to get your attention, let's talk about how you do that. Go listen to what he has to say. Lesson 2, Samuel stayed in step with God despite the direction those around him were moving. That this isn't just countercultural. This is Samuel, although everyone around him seems to be moving in one particular direction, and Samuel is moving in a different direction than everyone. It's not just to be countercultural. He's in step with God, which means sometimes he's going to be moving in the opposite direction of everybody else around him, and so he stayed in step with him. And so it's not Samuel against the world, or Samuel against Eli, or Samuel against culture and everything that's around him. It's Samuel in step with God, moving in the direction God is asking him to move. And if that takes him against the grain of culture, that's fine. If that takes him against the grain of what everyone around him is doing, that's fine. His goal is not just to make a point, it's to be in step with God. Because it's not us against the world. It's us working with God for the sake of the world, us living our lives in step with God, operating differently for the sake of those who operate differently than us. God is on mission, so staying in step with God means we are on mission too, not just countercultural, but saying, how can we carry the gospel in a different and unique way? How can we do what God's asking us to do? Lesson 3, Samuel stayed in step with God, even in the hard stuff. When you are faced with the decision between, I don't want to do this, and that tension, that it's like, I don't want to do this, but I do want to stay in step with God, choose to stay in step with God. And then trust him with the hard stuff that he's placed in front of you. And then lesson 4, Samuel's life brought life and connection with God to his people. That it took one child listening to what God had to say, this conversation in the night that God spoke. And in that conversation, God began to do not something just that shaped Samuel's life, but that actually changed the trajectory of the people of God, that actually meant that the people of God could live differently in relationship with God, that Samuel's life, the choices and the way that he made his decisions brought life and connection with God to his people. Not because he was a person of like extraordinary authority, not because he was some kind of superhero, not because he was like uniquely qualified, but because he listened to what God said. And he chose to live his life in step with him, and that had ripples. And that changed the way God's people live their lives. Our choices have ripples. So then how do we live out this story in our lives? So we don't just want Samuel moments, we want to live a Samuel style of life. What about just a simple prayer? To take those words spoken in that church basement that were echoing the words that were spoken in a temple a lot of years before that. Speak, for your servant hears. Right? That's active. That's like listening, not just is like taking note of, but listening, putting it into practice. It's a whole prayer. God, would you speak for your servant, the one who's ready to respond, to live in step with the master, who's giving direction for our lives, hears, is ready to listen, put into practice. It's a prayer, by the way, that works in all kinds of seasons. So it's a prayer for when God is speaking. How do we respond when God's speaking? God, speak, for your servant hears. I'm ready to act. God, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to put into practice what you're asking me to do. It's a prayer for when God is speaking, but it's also a prayer for when God is silent. That into that silence, our inability to hear at certain points in our lives what God is saying, God, would you speak, for your servant hears. It's a request. It's not a demand of God. It's a request of God. It's preparation for listening. And it's a reminder to us that God speaks. So it becomes an invitation for us to live our lives in conversation. The question is, what's making it hard to hear? When we look at our lives, what is louder than the voice of God in our lives that drowns out what God is trying to tell us? What are we allowing to create so much noise? And some of it might be good stuff, but what is it that we're allowing to create so much noise that we're actually unable to hear what God is saying? We've kept ourselves so busy. We've filled all the available voids in our lives. We have almost no capacity to hear God. What is it that's louder than the voice of God in your life? God, would you show me that? And then God, would you speak so that I can hear, so I can live my life in step with you? It's a prayer for when God seems distant, because it's not that God has moved. It's not that the master has wandered off and left the servant to try and figure things out. It's that the inattentive servant might not be paying attention to what God is having to say. So when God seems distant, it's not because he's moved. The question is, what needs to happen in us? We stay close by staying in step with him. And it's a prayer for when the world seems broken. When we look and we see the headlines, when we see the stuff in social media, when we see the stuff on the news and in our news feeds, and we look and we're like, there's so much wrong, and there's this stuff that rises up in us, and we want to fix it, or we want to just like talk about it, or gripe about it, or be critical of it. A prayer for when the world seems broken. God, speak, for your servant hears. When the world is not as it should be, God, what is it that you want to do through me about the stuff that I'm seeing in the world around me? God, this thing is breaking my heart. God, this thing is creating some real tension in me. Speak. What would you have me do about this? And then we listen and say, God, what do you want to do to help fix a broken world through me? And then we act. It's a beautiful journey. It's an invitation of a lifetime to live our lives in step with God.